Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are peering deep beneath the pavement, beyond the smart meters, and into the essential, often invisible grid that powers modern America.
That's right.
We are diving into American Electric Power, or AEP.
And when we talk about American infrastructure, I mean, AEP is a company that is just absolutely foundational.
Foundational but hidden.
Exactly. Its colossal influence is largely invisible to the average person. Most people only interact with it when the bill arrives or when the power goes out.
Right.
We're talking about a true hidden giant in the energy space, and its sheer scale, both physical and financial, is, frankly, it's staggering.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little. We've been through all the source material, and the mission for this deep dive seems pretty clear to me. We need to fully comprehend the massive scale and, well, the labyrinthine structure of this whole enterprise. But I think more importantly, we need to get into the immense tension at its core. The tension between its legacy as, a polluting giant, its ambitions for these groundbreaking clean energy projects, and its highly contentious regulatory record.
Especially its policy wars against decentralized power. That's a huge piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely.
And we really have to start with the numbers because they immediately put this behemoth into context.
Right.
AEP isn't just a major utility. It is one of the largest electric utility holding companies in the entire country.
Serving how many people?
Over 5 million customers across 11 states. It stretches all the way from the Great Lakes down to the Texas coast.
That geographic scope is already astounding, but the physical infrastructure numbers are what really, they really leap off the page.
They do.
AEP owns nearly 38,000 megawatts of generating capacity. But the real headliner for me, the thing that just blew my mind, is the transmission system.
Oh, absolutely.
They have a nearly 39,000-mile network of transmission lines.
Yeah.
Just to give you a mental picture, that's enough high-voltage wire to wrap around the Earth about 1.5 times.
And it's not just the length of the wire, right?
Yeah.
It's the technological superiority, the voltage capacity.
Yes.
AEP owns more 765 kilovolt ultra-high voltage transmission lines than all other U.S. transmission systems combined.
Combined, that is a critical distinction. These aren't just your local distribution lines running down the street.
No, not at all. These are the superhighways of the Eastern Grid. They enable the bulk movement of massive amounts of power from, say, a huge power plant to entire population centers hundreds of miles away.
So that infrastructure is really AEP's strategic advantage.
It's their defining technical legacy. It's what makes them so indispensable.
Yeah.
Hashtag tag the geography of power, AEP's massive footprint and structure.
Okay, so let's start putting this giant on the map, both, geographically and financially. We need to understand the colossal footprint that AEP manages day to day.
And looking at the financials, you can see this is a multi-billion-dollar operation. It's something that requires constant massive capital investment just to maintain.
What are we talking about in terms of revenue?
The source material is pretty clear. For 2024, revenue clocked in at $19.72 billion.
Wow.
And their total assets are valued at an astounding $103.1 billion.
$100 billion in assets.
Yeah. And this isn't just, high finance on paper. This is the management of truly deep-pocketed, mission-critical infrastructure. These are assets that, if they fail, can take down entire sections of the national economy.
And as you say, those assets are mission critical on a national scale. That immense 39,000-mile transmission system isn't just padding their balance sheet. It is literally the backbone of regional power delivery.
It provides about 10% of the electricity demand in the Eastern Interconnection.
Okay, so for those who might not know, what exactly is the Eastern Interconnection?
It's essentially the largest interconnected grid on the continent. It covers 38 eastern and central U.S. states. So AEP's lines are carrying 1/10 of all the power flowing through that vast system.
So their stability, or lack thereof, directly impacts tens of millions of people who aren't even their direct customers.
Exactly. Their resilience matters to almost everyone east of the Rockies.
And they're also a huge player in Texas, which of course has its own unique, often isolated grid.
That's right. AEP supplies approximately 11% of the electricity demand in ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas.
So they're woven into the national power fabric, but they have to manage that fabric under two completely different regulatory and technical frameworks.
Yes, the highly integrated Eastern Interconnection and the largely autonomous ERCOT. It's an incredible balancing act.
So how do they manage this huge, diverse landscape of state-level regulation, different energy demands, different political climates?
Well, they do it by not being one single monolithic entity. AEP is structured as a system of 7 major geographic local operating companies. And this is where the real complexity lies.
This is a crucial point, right? It gets to the heart of how utility regulation actually works in the U.S.
It is. Because utilities are regulated at the state level, AEP has to operate these distinct, legally separate companies. They need them to deal with the public utility commissions, the PUCs, in each of their service states.
And each one has its own rate base, its own specific energy mix.
Exactly. The mix is determined by regional resources, what's available and what's cheapest in that area.
So let's run through this subsidiary map. This is how AEP actually manages serving 5 million customers across 11 different regulatory territories. Where do we start?
We should start with AEP Ohio. This is the corporate nerve center. The main headquarters are in Columbus.
And it's their largest subsidiary, right?
By far. It serves 1.5 million customers. And it's a great example of that structural consolidation we're talking about.
How so?
Well, it actually used to be 2 separate operating companies within Ohio, Ohio Power and Columbus Southern Power.
Oh, interesting.
Then in 2014, they just merged Columbus Southern into Ohio Power.
Yeah.
It was a clear move to simplify the legal entity, to make dealing with the Ohio PUC more efficient.
Okay, so from Ohio, let's jump all the way down to AEP, Texas. The Texas operation has a really fascinating origin story, and it's tied directly to one of AEP's biggest corporate moves.
Indeed. AEP Texas was basically formed from the companies that AEP officially acquired during that landmark 1997 acquisition of the Central and Southwest Corporation, or CSW.
Right.
It essentially operates today as 2 merged entities.
Mm-hmm.
You've got AEP Texas North, which was formerly West Texas Utilities, and AEP Texas Central, which used to be Central Power and Light.
And they cover the western and southern parts of Texas.
Right, respectively. And that split really just reflects the historical service areas that AEP inherited. It adds another layer of complexity to managing things inside the competitive Texas market.
Okay, so now moving east and north, we find Appalachian Power, or APCO. And that name alone just evokes the history of power generation and, frankly, the history of coal in that region.
Absolutely. APCO is headquartered in Charleston, West Virginia, and it serves about 1 million customers.
And its territory is pretty sprawling.
And challenging. It covers central and southern West Virginia, southwest Virginia, and a small but important part of northeast Tennessee, right around Kingsport.
And Kingsport used to be its own thing too, right?
Yeah, it did. Kingsport Power, which served that Tennessee area, was functionally merged into Appalachian Power. Again, it's part of AEP's ongoing push for efficiency.
And right next door is Indiana-Michigan Power, or I&M. This one has a unique profile because of a very specific, very large generation asset.
Right. I&M serves major industrial and population centers like Muncie and Fort Wayne in Indiana and parts of southwest Michigan, including South Bend.
But the jewel in the crown there is the nuclear plant.
The Donald C. Cook Nuclear Power Plant, which is located in I&M's territory. And the presence of that nuclear plant gives I&M a distinct, carbon-free baseload power source.
Which really differentiates its generation mix and, I imagine, its regulatory profile from its more coal-heavy neighbor.
Exactly. It's a huge strategic asset for them.
Next up, Kentucky Power. It's based in Ashland and serves the eastern, more rugged parts of Kentucky. And this particular subsidiary has been in the news a lot recently.
A ton, specifically around a dramatic and ultimately failed sale attempt. We'll definitely get into that.
For sure.
But yeah, it serves the communities that are right up against the Appalachian Power Service area, places like Pikeville, Hazard, and Ashland. It's deeply connected to that crucial Appalachian coal region.
Okay, and finally we hit the rest of the old CSW properties in the middle of the country.
Right, you've got the Public Service Company of Oklahoma, PSO, incorporated way, way back in 1913.
Wow.
PSO serves about 540,000 customers across a huge 30,000 square mile service area in eastern and southwestern Oklahoma. Its headquarters are in Tulsa.
And the last one is the Southwestern Electric Power Company, SWEPCO.
SWEPCO. That's the third of the former CSW operating companies. It serves western Arkansas, northwestern Louisiana, and northeastern Texas.
So when you look at the whole map, AEP is managing regulatory frameworks and service obligations in 11 states.
Right. But its structure is largely dictated by 2 major historical events. The initial consolidation of that central system we mentioned, and that sprawling 2000 merger with CSW.
It's a dizzying corporate map.
It is, but it's really the only way they can manage all that regional energy diversity and multi-state compliance. Hashtag historical milestones and technical prowess. So to really understand AEP's current dominance, both technically and in the market, we need to shift gears a bit and look at its history, because it's filled with these genuine technical firsts that really shaped the development of the modern U.S. grid.
Yeah, this history isn't just a bunch of dry corporate facts. It really is the story of foundational utility innovation. So let's trace the origins. The company we know today as American Electric Power started over a century ago, right, as electrification was really taking off.
Exactly. The direct predecessor was a company called the American Gas and Electric Company, or AG&E. It was incorporated in 1906.
And that replaced an even earlier company.
Right, the Electric Company of America from 1899. So this lineage places them right at the very beginning of utility-scale power precision, that big shift away from localized power generation toward regional systems.
And crucially, they weren't just building plants to match existing designs. They were actually inventing new ways to make power more efficient, which is a quest that has basically defined the industry ever since.
Yes, and they're credited with a major innovation in power generation efficiency almost a century ago.
This is the steam reheat thing.
The steam reheat. That technical pioneering moment happened in 1923 at the Philo Power Plant in Philo, Ohio.
And what do they do?
AG&E built the first plant in the world to reheat steam to do double duty in the process of generating electricity.
So, in simple terms, what does that actually mean?
Well, think of it this way. A conventional turbine gets a lot of energy from high-pressure steam, but it hits a limit. By reheating the steam that was already partially used and sending it back to the turbine, they basically gave it a second, very efficient life.
So they got more electricity out of the same amount of coal.
Significantly more.
Eh.
It boosted the thermal efficiency of the entire process. And that innovation, born in Ohio, became standard practice across the entire world.
But AEP's biggest claim to fame, the thing that gives them their enduring strategic advantage today, is their dominance in high-voltage transmission. This is where they really become a leader in grid architecture.
Absolutely. The need for high voltage came about because AG&E realized they could build these massive, super efficient coal plants near the cheap fuel sources, like in Appalachia.
And then move the power hundreds of miles away to where people actually lived.
Exactly, to population centers like Chicago or Washington, D.C. But to do that efficiently, they had to minimize the energy lost in transmission. And the way you do that is by cranking up the voltage.
So they were the first utility to use 345 kilovolt transmission lines.
A major milestone reached in 1953.
And the 765 kV system is just the ultimate expression of that leadership. That's more than double the voltage of the system they pioneered in the 50s.
Precisely. And as we said, they own more 765 kilovolt ultra-high voltage, or UHV, transmission lines than all other U.S. systems combined.
Which is just a crazy statistic.
It's a critical strategic advantage. Those 765 kV lines allow AEP to move immense amounts of power. We're talking gigawatts, not megawatts, with way less energy loss than lower voltage systems. It solidified their role as the crucial intermediary in the Eastern interconnection. They can move electricity at high speed across the entire system.
So moving beyond the technology, the corporate evolution of AEP has also been really complex, and it's been largely dictated by these major federal policy shifts designed to rein in these sprawling power empires.
And the biggest one, without a doubt, was the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935, or PUHCA.
PUHCA. You really can't discuss AEP's structure without understanding PUHCA.
You can't. This was a New Deal-era law, and it was designed to simplify utility ownership structures, which had become incredibly complex and often geographically bizarre. It forced utilities to sell off holdings that weren't geographically continuous or operationally related.
So what did that mean for AEP specifically? They had to sell off a lot of assets, didn't they?
They did. Following PUHCA, AEP, which was then still AG&E, had to divest numerous non-contiguous holdings, companies like Atlantic City Electric and Scranton Electric.
But they managed to keep their core.
Yes, they successfully managed to retain what was designated as their central system. This core network, which ran cohesively from Michigan down to Virginia, was deemed functionally integrated. That allowed them to maintain this powerful, cohesive operational footprint centered on the Appalachian coal fields and the industrial Midwest.
And the name change itself to American Electric Power, that came later.
In 1958, that's right. And then we also see a geographical consolidation. In the 1980s, they moved the headquarters out of New York City, where they had been since the early days of corporate finance.
Moved to Columbus, Ohio.
Right. And that cemented Ohio as their operational and administrative heart. It put them closer to their largest customer base and a lot of their major generation capacity.
And then the final, most defining corporate shift of the modern era was that massive merger around the turn of the millennium. It just dramatically changed their service territory.
The 2000 merger with Central and Southwest Corporation, CSW, for $10 billion. It was transformational.
This wasn't just an acquisition.
No, it was a horizontal expansion that fundamentally changed AEP's entire identity. The deal brought in those four core CSW operating companies we talked about: Central Power and Light, West Texas Utilities, PSO in Oklahoma, and SWEPSCO.
And that instantly expanded AEP's footprint deep into the Southwest.
All of a sudden, their legacy Appalachian system was connected to the totally distinct energy landscape of Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. It turned them from a Midwest and Appalachian giant into a true multi-regional behemoth. Hashtag the energy mix, nuclear, coal, and early green efforts.
Okay, so now that we have a handle on the geography, the structure, the history, let's look at what actually powers AEP's grid, the energy mix. And this portfolio really reflects a legacy utility in transition, which is often a very slow and fraught process.
The mix is still very significantly influenced by traditional sources. I mean, that's just a reality given the scale of their operations. But AEP does stand out among many of its peers for its serious long-term commitment to nuclear power as a baseload source.
Let's talk about that nuclear commitment. Is it really a strategic choice for the future, or is it just the cost of maintaining a valuable but old asset?
I think it's both, but it's leaning heavily towards strategic value. Their entire nuclear profile centers on the ownership and operation of the Donald C. Cook nuclear power plant.
Which is in the Indiana-Michigan power, the I&M territory.
Correct. And that facility provides essential carbon-free power. It accounts for a noticeable 6% of their total generation portfolio.
And in an era where reducing carbon intensity is everything, that's a stable, reliable asset. It gives them 247 power without intermittency issues.
Which is incredibly valuable for anyone trying to manage a grid, absolutely.
However, the overwhelming bulk of AEP's historical generation, and thus its most complex legacy, lies squarely in coal.
That is the unavoidable truth when you discuss AEP. Their history, the location of their central system, it was all deeply intertwined with coal power plants. And this legacy has led to some major, very costly issues.
Including one incident that actually involved the company buying out an entire town because of pollution.
That anecdote is just striking. The sources mention that AEP bought much of the town of Cheshire, Ohio, because of pollution issues coming from the nearby Gavin power plant.
It's hard to imagine a starker consequence of industrial operations.
It is a devastating real-world consequence. Cheshire sits right next to the massive Gavin plant. The residents complained for years about continuous chemical odors, health problems, pervasive pollution. It just fundamentally destroyed their quality of life.
So instead of fully mitigating the problem,
They reached a $20 million deal in 2002 to purchase 114 properties. They essentially paid the town to dissolve. That single event just encapsulates the social contract failure that defines that high-pollutant era of utility operations.
So following that era, AEP was at least attempting to address this dilemma of high emissions while still trying to retain coal as a primary fuel source. What was the technology they proposed?
In 2004, they announced these pretty ambitious plans to build what are called integrated gasification combined cycle, or IGCC coal-fired plants.
What is that exactly?
The IGCC process basically converts coal into a synthetic gas before you burn it. And that allows for easier removal of pollutants, and it can potentially generate power more efficiently than just traditional coal burning.
So it was a technological gamble.
A huge gamble, an attempt to, greenwash or at least clean up the most abundant domestic fuel source.
Yeah.
Many of those projects were later canceled or stalled because of cost, but the initial plan showed they were at least looking for technological solutions to their environmental rap sheet.
This brings us to a period where AEP started showing some early, if maybe tentative, signs of incorporating greener tech, moving beyond just building massive power plants. You can even see it in their vehicle fleet.
Exactly. Their early green efforts included expanding their service fleet with International Durastar hybrid diesel trucks. Now, it sounds like a small detail in a multi-billion-dollar company, but it showed an institutional awareness of efficiency, of trying to reduce the environmental footprint of their own maintenance and operations division.
And they were surprisingly ahead of the curve in terms of grid integration with electric vehicles. That's a concept that is absolutely central to today's energy transition.
This is fascinating foresight, really. They partnered with Ford on a vehicle-to-power grid communication system, and this is back when EVs were still a total novelty.
What did this system do?
It allowed hybrid vehicles to communicate directly with the power company about critical factors, like where they were recharging, how long they planned to charge, and what the optimal cost and duration would be based on real-time grid conditions.
So is this a very early attempt to manage the distributed load of future EVs?
They were anticipating the challenge of millions of vehicles suddenly plugging into the grid. It was very forward-thinking.
So beyond fleet efficiency and EV planning, AEP also made some early ventures into utility-scale solar and wind generation.
Yes, often through power purchase agreements or direct ownership. It signaled a recognition that the mix just had to change.
Where did we see this first?
We see clear evidence of this starting around the late 2000s. They signed a deal to purchase power from the Wyandotte solar field in Upper Sandusky, Ohio.
And at the time, that was one of the largest solar fields in the eastern U.S.
It was. And they also directly entered the wind market by owning and operating facilities like the Desert Sky Wind Farm and the Trent Wind Farm.
And they weren't just passively building renewables, they were actively studying the integration challenges for the entire Eastern interconnection, recognizing their role as the transmission expert.
Yes, in 2009, AEP partnered with other major energy companies to commission this highly complex study. It focused on the logistics of moving wind energy generated in the upper Midwest effectively to consumers out east.
So this duality is really key.
It is. AEP is focused on investing in renewables, but their primary concern is always the overarching transmission challenge. How do you integrate these intermittent resources into the UHV network that they built their empire on? #tag ambition, conflict, and canceled megaprojects.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and where it reveals the high-stakes political and regulatory world that these utilities live in. We're moving from stable operations and incremental green efforts to massive headline-grabbing ambitions that, more often than not, have been blocked by regulatory and economic headwinds.
This is the part of the story that reveals the immense difficulty and the high-cost reality of modernizing a huge utility. A single regulatory decision can wipe out billions of dollars in planned investment.
And a perfect place to start is the most recent setback, the attempted sale of Kentucky Power.
Right. This was a proposed $2.8 billion sale of their Kentucky Power subsidiary to Liberty Utilities, which is part of Algonquin Power and Utilities.
This deal was announced in 2021, and it dragged on for almost 2 years. So first, why did AEP want to sell in the first place?
Well, from their perspective, they wanted to divest a capital-intensive asset that was frankly struggling in a declining coal-dependent region. The idea was to reallocate that capital somewhere else in their system.
And the opposition was immediate.
Immediate and strong. The Kentucky Attorney General, local lawmakers, they were intensely worried about the impact on customers. Specifically, they feared that the new owner, Liberty Utilities, would be less accountable to local interests.
And that the sale, which was intended to generate a profit for AEP shareholders, would just inevitably result in skyrocketing rates for Kentucky customers.
Exactly. And even after the Kentucky State Commission offered a kind of conditional approval, the final roadblock came from the federal level, specifically from FRC.
The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission.
And that's the critical element that killed the deal. In December of 2022, FERC refused approval.
And their reasoning was pretty damning.
It was. FERC stated that AEP and Liberty did not provide enough evidence to show the deal wouldn't have an adverse effect on ratepayers. In other words, AEP couldn't prove that its customers wouldn't suffer from the deal.
So after a final failed reapplication,
AEP and Liberty announced the termination of the $2.8 billion sale in April 2023.
it just demonstrates the immense scrutiny that utilities face when they try these major divestitures, especially if the perception is that the sale is prioritizing shareholder profit over ratepayer stability.
Absolutely. Now let's look a bit further back to a massive multi-state transmission project that really exemplifies AEP's ambitious UHV culture. PATH, the Potomac Appalachian Transmission Highline proposal.
The PATH proposal, launched around 2007, was just colossal in scope and cost.
It was intended to be a 290-mile, 765-kilovolt transmission line, their specialty running through West Virginia, Virginia, and Maryland.
And the initial price tag was already huge.
$1.8 billion, which quickly swelled to $2.1 billion by 2011. The idea was simple. Build a new electrical superhighway to relieve congestion on the grid and open up pathways for new power sources.
So, what were the benefits that AEP promised regulators and the public to justify that enormous expense?
They promised significant environmental and economic benefits. They projected that this new line and its associated technology would reduce CO2 emissions by 380,000 short tons annually, just by enabling more efficient energy flows.
And crucially, they argued it was necessary to transmit massive amounts of future renewable energy.
Right, things like wind and solar to eastern markets. And of course, they claimed it would create 5,700 construction jobs.
Sounds like a powerful argument. Clean energy and jobs. So, why did this $2.1 billion project never get built?
Well, despite the claimed benefits, the project faced overwhelming local disputes, right-of-way battles, and legal hurdles from landowners and environmental groups who just did not want these massive 765 QOV lines crossing their property.
But the final nail in the coffin came from the market operator.
Yes. PJM Interconnection, which is the regional grid operator for the Mid-Atlantic, officially removed Path from its long-range expansion plans in August 2012.
And their reason was purely economic.
Purely pragmatic. The Great Recession had slowed the economy, and that reduced the projected growth in electricity use. The need for that specific massive expenditure just vanished. It proves that grid planning is highly sensitive to macroeconomic trends.
So, moving from transmission ambition to generation ambition, we have to talk about the Windcatcher saga. This was maybe AEP's most dramatic recent clean energy failure.
Oh, Windcatcher. Announced in 2017, it represented this massive bet on renewable energy ownership. It was planned as a $4.5 billion, 2,000-megawatt wind farm.
On a sprawling 300,000-acre site in the Oklahoma Panhandle, it was supposed to be one of the world's largest wind farms.
It was, and AEP's subsidiaries, PSO and SWEPSO, sought regulatory approval to basically purchase the farm from the developer, Invenergy, once construction was complete.
A $4.5 billion commitment is just enormous. But the regulatory approval process was essentially a multi-state regulatory cage match, wasn't it?
That's a great way to put it, because the power would flow to customers in 4 states, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. They needed approval from all 4 regulatory bodies.
And that's where things went wrong.
They gained traction in some areas, but the project ran into intense opposition, especially in Texas. Ratepayers and consumer advocates argued that the financial risk of building such a massive, distant project, plus the cost of connecting it to the grid, was being unfairly pushed onto customers, not shareholders.
And Texas, where AEP has significant operations, became the fatal flaw.
The Texas Public Utility Commission ultimately denied the proposal. That single regulatory failure caused a cascade. As a result of the opposition and the denied approval, AEP realized the project was just not viable as planned.
And the entire $4.5 billion endeavor was canceled in July 2018.
A powerful lesson in how multi-state regulation can halt even the largest capital projects.
So we have a clear pattern here of these massive capital-intensive projects failing because of regulatory hurdles or shifting economics. But AEP eventually learned from these painful setbacks, didn't they?
They did, and that leads to a successful large-scale wind project that really highlights a more flexible, smarter approach.
The North Central Energy Facilities, NCEF.
That's the critical contrast. This project, approved between 2020 and 2022, was a little smaller, totaling 1,485 megawatts, and it was split between PSO and SWEPSCO.
So what was the key difference? What allowed NCEF to succeed where Windcatcher, which was similar in size, failed so spectacularly?
3 things: scalability, flexibility, and infrastructure leverage. The biggest flaw of Windcatcher was the cost and controversy of that new, massive 765 kilovolt transmission line they needed to move the power.
Right.
The NCEF facilities, by contrast, were specifically sited near existing PSO and SWEPQ transmission systems.
So that significantly reduced complexity and cost.
And the need for new rights-of-way, it just made the whole project infinitely more palatable to skeptical regulators.
But even this successful project was subject to that complex state-by-state regulatory environment. They didn't get 100% approval across the board.
And that's a testament to the persistent difficulty. The project was approved by Oklahoma, Arkansas, which took 268 megawatts, and Louisiana, which took 464.
But Texas said no again.
The Texas PUC denied its 309 megawatt share, citing similar concerns about ratepayer impact. But crucially, because NCEF was designed to be modular, PSO and SWEPCO simply went forward with the approved portions instead of abandoning the entire venture.
That flexibility allowed them to actually complete the 3 major wind farms.
Sundance, Maverick, and Traverse, which at 999 megawatts is the largest. They proved they could build big, but they had to learn to build smart and surgically. Hashtag the environmental ledger and regulatory battles.
This successful pivot toward utility-scale wind is really essential context because AEP's environmental record is one of the most scrutinized aspects of its operations, and it stems directly from that historical reliance on the coal-fired central system we discussed earlier.
This is the heavy price of their pioneering infrastructure. And we really have to put this environmental history into measurable context first. When you talk about the sheer impact, one key source cited the Political Economy Research Institute.
And they ranked AEP as what, 55th among corporations emitting airborne pollutants in the U.S.?
That's right. And the sheer quantity of toxic air we're talking about is just immense.
What were the numbers?
In 2018 alone, the quantity was 2.24 billion pounds.
Billion with a B.
Yes. That's over 1 million tons of toxic air released in a single year. And the major pollutants are nasty industrial byproducts: sulfuric and hydrochloric acids, heavy metals like chromium, manganese, and nickel compounds.
The kind of materials that require immense, expensive mitigation efforts today.
Exactly. And the broader societal impact of these emissions is huge, particularly for the eastern U.S., which sits downwind of the Ohio River Valley.
Right, the pollution doesn't stay put.
Not at all. The environmental footprint extends far beyond the fence line of the plants. AEP and similar power plants collectively account for nearly 70% of sulfur dioxide, SO2, emissions each year, and 30% of nitrogen oxides, or non-ox.
And both of those cause serious respiratory damage.
They do, but when they combine with moisture in the atmosphere, they fall back to Earth as acid rain, which damages ecosystems, forests, and human-made structures all across the Northeast.
This decades-long record of high emissions is what eventually led to one of the most significant legal battles in the history of the Clean Air Act. This was a major regulatory reckoning.
We're talking about the landmark lawsuit filed by the U.S. Justice Department on November 3rd, 1999.
And it was against AEP and 6 other power companies.
Right. And the DOJ alleged that AEP had undertaken major renovations to its coal plants without installing modern pollution controls, which was a clear violation of the Clean Air Act's new source review provisions. This was a massive legal challenge that dragged on for 8 years.
So what were the final, staggering terms of the settlement, which was reached in 2007?
The settlement, finalized in October 2007, forced AEP to commit a staggering $4.6 billion to install state-of-the-art pollution control equipment across their fleet.
And that wasn't a fine. That was mandatory infrastructure spending.
It was a fundamental change in their operational budgeting. And on top of that, they faced direct financial penalties, a $15 million civil fine, plus a commitment of $60 million total for various environmental projects and mitigation efforts in the affected communities.
And what was the tangible environmental result of that massive settlement?
The company committed to cutting 813,000 short tons of air pollutants annually. And the agreement was highly specific. It placed emission caps on 16 coal plants across 5 core AEP states: West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, Ohio, and Indiana.
So this lawsuit fundamentally changed the economics of their entire coal fleet.
It forced them to either modernize these facilities at massive cost or eventually just retire them.
In more recent years, perhaps hastened by those multi-billion-dollar penalties, AEP has moved to set some aggressive, long-term carbon reduction goals. It signals a clear shift away from that high pollutant legacy.
Their initial long-term goal, announced around 2018, was to reduce carbon emissions by 80% by 2050.
And they do that primarily through retiring coal and ramping up renewables, natural gas, and energy efficiency programs.
Right. And more recently, they've sharpened that target. They are now aiming for net zero emissions by 2045.
And their reported progress shows a significant accelerated downward trend in carbon output in a really short time frame.
The numbers confirm the seriousness of the shift. Their total CO2 equivalent emissions dropped dramatically from over 91,000 kilotons in 2017 down to under 50,000 in 2020.
So that's a reduction of over 45% in just 3 years.
It is. And that rapid reduction is primarily a result of retiring some of the most carbon-intensive capacity. It proves that massive cuts are possible when economic and regulatory pressure align.
And finally, as part of this environmental evolution, they're not just dealing with generation, they're actively trying to shape the future of transportation within their service territories because they recognize EVs as a growing source of load.
Right. The source notes their forward-looking $10 million program in Ohio, which launched in 2018. The program was designed to incentivize the installation of EV infrastructure across the state.
Aiming for up to 375 charging stations.
Exactly. And this aligns with the broader utility strategy to spur EV adoption. which increases future electricity demand while also helping to manage the new electric load that those vehicles represent. Hashtag contradictory actions, the anti-solar stance. So we've established that AEP is this complex giant. It's investing billions in clean energy infrastructure, successfully building utility-scale wind, and facing these massive regulatory penalties for its polluting past. But now we have to address the central, defining contradiction that runs through all of their recent regulatory efforts.
This is the most fascinating tension point in the source material. Despite investing in their own large solar and wind farms, centralized assets that they control, AEP has received significant, persistent criticism for actively fighting smaller distributed energy
Specifically rooftop solar.
in nearly every state they operate in.
This is that zero-sum question you raised earlier. AEP's strategy appears to be one of supporting the energy transition only when it maintains their centralized control of generation and transmission assets.
And the criticism spans a wide geographic area.
Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, West Virginia, Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio. It reveals this calculated business philosophy that sees decentralized generation as the fundamental threat to their traditional monopoly structure.
Let's focus on the Oklahoma example, because that's perhaps the clearest legislative victory for the anti-solar movement that was backed by AEP. Their subsidiary, PSO, was directly involved in pushing this policy.
Very involved. In 2014, the Oklahoma governor signed an AEP-backed bill into law. And this legislation just fundamentally targeted the economics of rooftop solar.
How did it do that?
It explicitly added a mandatory fixed charge or tax onto anyone in the state who adopted rooftop solar. This fee was independent of how much power they actually drew from the grid.
So the effect was immediate. It just added a financial burden.
It significantly extended the payback period for a homeowner's solar investment. It made distributed solar much less financially attractive and just slowed adoption to a crawl.
And a similar pattern of this calculated policy maneuvering emerged in the SWEPC territory in Louisiana and Arkansas. It shows this concerted, multi-year attempt to eliminate key distributed generation policies.
Right. SWEPC made repeated attempts between 2013 and 2014 to eliminate net metering policy at the Louisiana Public Service Commission, the LPSC.
And net metering is the policy that allows residential solar owners to get credited for the excess energy they push back onto the grid.
Usually at or near the retail rate. For a utility, net metering reduces revenue and it introduces variability, forcing them to manage a decentralized supply.
So SWEPCO's persistence, even though they failed each time, highlights how fundamentally opposed they are to this model.
Even as they embrace utility-scale solar, where they can control the price and the flow of electrons.
And these policy battles carried significant political implications, didn't they? It led to further criticism about the connection between AET's regulatory influence and its political funding.
This is where the policy discussion bleeds into political influence. SWEPC was specifically criticized for backing an openly anti-solar candidate, Eric Skrmetta, for a seat on the LPSC.
And this candidate, in turn, faced wider public criticism.
For allegedly receiving 2/3 of his total campaign contributions from the very entities he was responsible for regulating.
Wow.
This dynamic shows how utilities attempt to influence the composition of regulatory bodies to ensure they get sympathetic ears when they're arguing for policies that restrict competition from smaller-scale energy providers like residential solar.
It's a calculated use of political capital to protect the centralized business model.
Exactly. And finally, this dedication to centralized control is underscored by their attempts to recover costs on legacy fossil fuel assets, even while they're investing in large-scale renewables.
The sources highlight the controversy around the cost burden of past coal projects in Arkansas.
Right. In 2015, SWEPSCO intended to ask Arkansas regulators for permission to pass along the costs of building and running the John W. Turk Jr. coal plant, which was described as the state's most expensive project in history.
Directly to Arkansas ratepayers.
A request that was guaranteed to be controversial. It was an attempt to make customers shoulder the financial risk of a massive, long-lived fossil fuel asset, rather than accepting stranded costs or absorbing them as a business risk.
So these actions, when you view them alongside the anti-solar campaign, reveal this highly polarized business model.
It's a model dedicated to recovering costs from owned centralized assets, regardless of the energy source. Hashtag outro.
So let's bring this deep dive back together. We've mapped the colossal financial and geographic footprint of American Electric Power, a company that provides nearly 10% of the electricity in the eastern U.S.
a company that pioneered the essential ultra-high voltage transmission lines that define our modern grid and whose assets are valued at over $100 billion.
We've seen their deep, complex history. From that efficiency breakthrough of steam reheat plants in 1923 to the massive, defining corporate expansion with the CSW merger in 2000.
And we've tracked the immense costly tension in their environmental legacy. I mean, absorbing $4.6 billion in mandatory cleanup expenses from the DOJ for past pollution.
While simultaneously committing to net zero by 2045 and successfully navigating the regulatory maze to build large wind farms like NCEF.
But the truly fascinating and maybe the defining contradiction is laid bare in their policy stance. AEP is an indispensable manager of essential centralized infrastructure.
But it operates under the constant shadow of these high-stakes project failures, Path, Windcatcher, the Kentucky sale, and a heavily scrutinized regulatory record of actively campaigning against distributed energy like rooftop solar across 7 states.
When you really synthesize the totality of the source material, the core conflict is not between clean and dirty energy. It's a high-stakes, multi-billion-dollar battle over the architecture of the grid itself.
That's a great way to put it.
Is AEP's future about managing centralized high-voltage flows across their vast 765 kV network? Or will it be forced to adapt to a decentralized, democratized system where customers also become suppliers through rooftop generation?
And their actions, investing heavily in massive wind and transmission while aggressively trying to tax rooftop solar customers, they answer that question for now.
They do. They want the transition, but only if they control every essential step of it.
So here's the final thought for you to carry forward from this deep dive. The difficulty of modernizing a system as massive and as entrenched as AEP's is not purely a technical challenge. It is a political and a financial one. What happens when a utility giant is simultaneously the champion of complex, multi-billion-dollar high-voltage infrastructure that enables the large-scale energy transition?
And the dedicated opponent of the simple, decentralized energy solution provided by residential solar.
Can AEP truly navigate the future by simultaneously embracing the power of the wind and aggressively fighting the power of the sun? Think about that the next time you flip a switch.